Murdered, a podcast. I'm your host, AB. And this week on Mama Murdered, a podcast, we're covering one of the most infamously covered cases in American history. The case of Jacob Wetterling. In 1989, Jacob was abducted on a late-night bike ride to a local store to rent a movie with his brother and his best friend. Jacob's body wouldn't be found until years and years later in 2016, and his body was found only about 30 miles away from where he lived at the time. So essentially, it took 9,827 days, or almost 27 years, before Jacob's parents ever got any kind of closure about what happened to their son. So with all that being said, and without further ado, let's get it. Jacob Wetterling was born to his parents, Jerry and Patty Wetterling, on February 17th, 1978, in Minnesota. Jacob was the second of the couple's 4 kids. Jacob had one older sister named Amy, a younger brother named Trevor, and another younger sister named Carmen. Jacob was very much a typical boy with a love of all things football, outdoors, and really any other sport that you can imagine that a little boy would be into. Jacob also loved to hang out with his best friend Aaron Larson. These 2 boys spent a good bit of their childhood together. They were extremely close. So close, in fact, that if you didn't know better, you may think they were brothers. Jacob and Aaron could often be found playing outside with the football in the yard together, riding bikes together, and they also loved to compare the football cards that they both collected. Jacob was the goalie for his soccer team, and he was the best kind of animal lover. And between his love of sports and his love of animals, Jacob had dreams of either becoming a veterinarian or a football player when he grew up. Because every little boy, at some point in their childhood, wants to be a famous sports player. And October 22nd, 1989 was no different than most days, with Jacob and his best friend Aaron hanging out. Aaron was actually supposed to be staying over at Jacob's that night for a sleepover, which wasn't anything out of the normal, and on this night, Jacob's parents were heading out to a dinner party. They were going to be leaving the kids home alone for a few hours, and this was an extremely normal thing to happen in the 80s and 90s. Parents would leave their kids home alone, and they would just kind of jot down a phone number to the restaurant or the friend's house or wherever it was that they would be that night. So parents would normally just leave the phone number to wherever they were going. It would be on the fridge or the counter, wherever. That way, if the kids need anything, then at least they have a way to get in touch with their parents. Because obviously, this was pre-cell phone years, we're in 1989. So that's exactly what Jacob's parents did. And this dinner party that Jerry and Patty were going to was in Clearwater, Minnesota, which is about 25 to 30 minutes from the Wetterling house in St. Joseph. So Aaron is spending the night with Jacob, and Jacob's parents are going to be gone for a few hours to this dinner party. Jacob and Aaron were staying home with a few of Jacob's other siblings, but both Jacob and his best friend Aaron were 11 at the time. Jacob's younger brother, Trevor, was just 10, and his younger sister Carmen was only 8. And like I said, this was completely normal in the 80s and 90s. This is where the term latchkey kids was coined. And it wasn't out of the usual for kids to be left home alone for a few hours at a time, and it was just different then. And even now, I feel like depending on your child and their maturity levels, 10 and 11 isn't crazy to leave them home for a short period of time. Like, even I do this, I will leave either one of my boys home alone. I don't trust them both to stay home alone together for any amount of time because they will fight and burn my house down. But if one of them's at their grandparents' house or at a friend's house and the other one's home and doesn't want to go with me, then I'll just leave them. So even I do this. It's not really that big of a deal, at least for me. And I'm sure that's how Jacob's parents were too. This was something that happened all the time in so many households. So Jacob's parents, Patty and Jerry, had already fed all the kids dinner beforehand before they headed out to the dinner party. And even though October 22nd was a Sunday, the kids didn't have school the next day, so this was the perfect opportunity for Jacob and Aaron to beg for one of them to stay the night at the other one's house. And everything leading up to this evening had been completely normal. Jacob and Aaron had played football, they had ridden bikes together, they had played outside, watched some sports, just normal things that Jacob and Aaron would always do together. But sometime after Jacob's parents had left the house for the dinner party, the kids had already kind of devised a plan. Jacob, Aaron, and Jacob's younger brother Trevor had been talking about riding their bikes to a nearby store that was only about 1.5 miles from the Wetterling house. Now, they wanted to ride their bikes to this store so that they could rent a movie, because back in the day, you had to rent movies, and you could do this at a gas station or grocery store. There were also whole-ass stores, and that's all they did was rent you VHSs. And of course, these VHS tapes had to be played on a bulky VCR, but still, this was one of the greatest treats for a 80s and 90s kid. I used to love going to Blockbuster and begging my mom to rent 5 different movies, knowing full well we only had time to watch one, and then begging her to buy $40 worth of popcorn and gummy bears to go with the movie, obviously. And if you don't know what a VCR or VHS or a Blockbuster is, you'll just have to Google it and figure out the term be kind and rewind. So that's exactly what Jacob, Aaron, and Trevor were trying to do. The store that the boys were trying to go to was called the Tom Thumb Convenience Store. And like I said, this store wasn't really very far from the Wetterling house, and I'm sure that the kids had probably ridden their bikes to this store before, so it probably wasn't like out of the parameters of where they could ride their bikes as long as they had permission, but that's me guessing. And it was around 9 p.m. and it was already dark outside, and their parents, they're not home. So when Jacob called the number to where his parents were at this dinner party, he asked his mom if all 3 of the boys could ride their bikes to the store, and she told them no. Patty knew that it was already dark outside, and that all 3 boys riding their bikes to the store would mean that 8-year-old Carmen would be left home alone. So she shut that idea down pretty quickly. But these boys weren't giving up that easily because they're boys. The boys waited a few minutes and they called the number to where their parents were at this dinner party again, but this time they asked to speak to Jacob's dad, Jerry, instead of his mom. Dads are always easier for boys to convince, so the boys pulled the old switcheroo where one parent says no to something, you wait a few minutes, you ask the other parent, and they say yes. It's the oldest trick in the book, but this time it worked. This time when the boys called and asked Jerry if they could ride their bikes to the Tom Thumb store, they told Jacob's dad, Jerry, that they would all wear their reflective gear. They even told Jerry that they'd already talked to Rochelle, who was their 14-year-old neighbor, and that she had already agreed to come over and watch 8-year-old Carmen while they were going to the store. They even told Jerry that they would all take flashlights with them while they ride to the store and back. And it seemed like Jerry wasn't really too much worried about something bad happening to the boys while they rode to the store and back. It seems like Jerry was more worried about cars not being able to see the boys in the dark. But it would be 3 boys riding together who had all promised to wear reflective gear and carry flashlights. So Jerry kind of figured that 3 boys in reflective gear would probably be hard to miss. So he tells the boys as long as someone will be there with 8-year-old Carmen, and as long as they take flashlights and wear their reflective gear, that they can go. So that's exactly what the boys did. They got Rochelle, the 14-year-old neighbor, to come over and sit with Jacob's little sister Carmen, and the boys put their reflective gear on, grabbed their flashlights, and they were off. The Wetterling house was in a cul-de-sac, and with the way that some of the roads led to dead ends, and then the way other roads split off only to lead to another dead end, there was essentially only one way that the boys could take to get to the Tom Thumb store. That is a mouthful. So the boys took off to the Tom Thumb store, and I've never heard of this store before, so I'm not really sure if I'm supposed to be saying the Tom Thumb store or just calling it Tom Thumb's, but either way, the boys make it to the store without incident, and they end up renting the movie, The Naked Gun. They head straight back home, just like they said they would. But while they were on their way back to Jacob's house to watch the movie, the boys were kind of walking their bikes beside them at this point. They weren't really getting in a hurry, and they just kind of had their bikes pushing alongside them instead of actually riding them at this point. There were no street lights that would have lit the road up that the boys were on, which is why they had agreed to take flashlights and wear reflective gear. And the boys were only about 1/2 mile away from the Wetterling house when a masked man with a gun in hand jumped out of the bushes of a driveway on the side of the road. This masked man ordered all 3 of the boys to turn their flashlights off, and he then told the boys to throw their bicycles down into the ditch. Naturally, the boys did as they were told. But can we just take a minute to think about how brazen this guy had to have actually been? Like, this would have been a very different situation if Jacob's parents would have just happened to have been driving home from their dinner party on this road at this exact time. Like, this man did not know where these boys were going or where their parents were. Like, what if a parent was supposed to be meeting these 3 boys at a halfway point to pick them and their bikes up because it was dark? I don't know. This is either really brazenly bold or just plain out stupid. But from what I could see, it looks like there are plenty of fields with extremely tall grass around for this man to hide in, which is probably why he chose this spot to begin with. But let's get back to the timeline. So, after making the boys throw their bikes into the nearby ditch, this man then told all 3 of the boys to lay flat on the pavement face down. He asked all 3 of the boys how old they were. Jacob's younger brother Trevor told the man that he was 10 years old. That's when the man ordered Trevor to get up and to run as far and as fast as he could, and he told Trevor not to turn around and look back at him or he would shoot him in the back. 10-year-old Trevor did as he was told, and he takes off running, leaving his older brother Jacob and Jacob's best friend Aaron behind. So Trevor's gone, he's safe, except for the major childhood trauma, but safe nonetheless. Then this man lifted both boys' faces up off the ground, and he presumably did this to be able to get a better look at Aaron and Jacob's faces. This unknown man then asked Aaron and Jacob how old they were, and they both answered that they were 11. Now, after he lifted their faces off the ground, he tells both the boys to get up, and this is when this guy just grabs Aaron in the crotch area. But right after he does this, the man tells Aaron to run as far and as fast as he can and not to turn around. So now Aaron is away from the man with the gun, and he's safe, again, except for the major childhood trauma. So now Aaron is running in the same direction that Trevor had been told to run in also. And to hear Trevor and Aaron retell this story and how everything played out, it seems like Trevor only had a very, very, very short head start before the man told Aaron to take off running too. Because it was pretty easy for Aaron to catch up with Trevor as they both ran away from where this man and Jacob were. And when Aaron and Trevor felt like they were far enough away to turn around safely without being shot, the 2 boys did turn around, and when they did, they saw that Jacob and the man were both gone from the spot where the man had originally jumped out at them at. It was just empty darkness now. Jacob and his abductor were both nowhere to be seen. And it was only a matter of minutes from the time that Aaron and Trevor were told to run to the time that Jacob and this masked man had just seemingly vanished. So a super short window of time for this masked man to get away with Jacob. The man lifted Jacob off the ground and he just kind of dragged him away from the spot where he had stopped all 3 of the boys at. So Jacob's younger brother Trevor and his best friend Aaron did eventually make their way back to the Wetterling house, and when they did, they both ran in and told Rochelle, who, remember, she was just the 14-year-old neighbor who had been kind of babysitting Jacob's younger sister Carmen since she was only 8 years old. And remember that the neighbor, Rochelle, was only sitting with 8-year-old Carmen long enough for the boys to ride to the store to rent the movie. She wasn't like a paid babysitter for the family. She was just kind of helping out a neighbor. And the store wasn't far from where Jacob lived, so it wouldn't have taken the 3 boys very long to get to the store, rent a movie, and be back home. So when Trevor and Aaron get back to the Wetterling house, they're explaining to Rochelle everything that had just happened to them. And they basically just tell her that a man with a gun and a mask had taken Jacob. And that's really all Rochelle needed to hear, because of course, she runs back to her own house to grab her dad. She's freaked out now too. She tells her dad everything that Aaron and Trevor had just told her, and of course, her dad gets over to the Wetterling house pretty quick. So Rochelle's dad hurries over to the Wetterling house where he found the number to call Jerry and Patty at the dinner party that they had been at, and he had to break the news that they needed to get home as quickly as they possibly could because a man with a gun had taken Jacob. He explains that the 3 boys had been stopped on their way home from the store by a man with a gun wearing a mask, and this man had taken Jacob. Now, Rochelle's dad told Jerry and Patty that he was going to go, they needed to get home quickly, but he was going to hang up so that he could call 911. Rochelle's dad calls 911 and tells the 911 dispatcher that the boys had come in and, that they had said that a man with a gun and a mask had taken Jacob. but that Aaron and Trevor didn't see a vehicle anywhere near the man that had taken Jacob, and that they couldn't tell what the man looked like because he had been wearing a dark-colored mask. And because of the mask, the boys weren't able to see any kind of distinct facial features or any defining marks like tattoos, birthmarks, moles, etc. Rochelle's dad explains to the dispatcher what Jacob was last seen wearing, which was a red hockey jacket with Jacob's last name embroidered on it, and that red hockey jacket also had a police department thing on the back of it in white lettering. The boys were kind of trying to explain what happened, but they're having to do it secondhand through Rochelle's dad, who is then relaying the events back in his own words to the 911 dispatcher. So instead of this convoluted mess, Rochelle's dad decides that it would probably be easier to just put Trevor on the phone with the dispatcher instead of relaying everything back and forth between Trevor and Aaron to the dispatcher. Which was probably smart on Rochelle's dad's end because the information is still fresh in Trevor and Aaron's heads. They're still hyped up on an adrenaline rush, and they're trying to piece together every second of that night after the man jumped out of the bushes at them. Trevor was able to tell the dispatcher that the man was kind of a bigger guy, and that the mask was a black mask that he thought was maybe a nylon mask. Now, it didn't take long after the 911 call that the sheriff's department was made aware of the kidnapping, and officers arrived on the scene pretty quickly after the 911 call was made. Actually, I think it was less than 10 minutes after the call was made. And when officers arrived, they find all three of the bikes still in the ditch. So they start searching all of the wooded area nearby because, again, Trevor and Aaron did not remember seeing a car anywhere nearby when this man came out of the woods at them. So police were probably hoping that this man couldn't have gotten far with Jacob, especially in such a short amount of time between the time that Jacob was taken and the time that the police were called and out on the scene. And police searched the entire general area until about 3 a.m. with no luck and no sign of Jacob. And it seems like I remember something I read saying that one of the boys had been riding a scooter and not a bike, like the kind of scooter that you would push with one foot. But that seems like a small detail. I just thought I'd mention it. Because either way, once 3 a.m. hit, the police decided that it was too dark outside, and at this point they were likely walking all over evidence that they wouldn't be able to see unless it was daylight out. So it seemed like a better idea to just wait a few hours and not trample all over potential evidence. Which I don't really know how I feel about this because the searches that night were called off at 3 a.m., but it was only a few hours later at 8 a.m. that the searches were back on, and this time, the sheriffs brought out scent dogs to help in the search. They also brought out helicopters, four-wheelers, and anything else that they thought would help. But with the help of scent dogs, police were led to a gravel road. Now, this gravel road was right off the main paved road that Jacob was taken from. So once police start looking around on this gravel road, they find tire tracks and shoe prints. But now that they found tracks from tires, police believe more likely that a car was used in the abduction, which before this, they had kind of been under the impression that there was no car used. Once they found the tire tracks, that kind of changed. Because again, Trevor and Aaron were adamant that they did not remember seeing a car anywhere nearby. But now police believe that there was actually a car involved, which just lets the police know that it's likely that this abductor and Jacob could have potentially gotten way further than what they'd originally thought. It's a lot easier to abduct someone and get out of town with a vehicle versus being on foot. And as far as the shoe prints that were found goes, there were what looked like grown men-sized footprints, and then there were a second set of prints, and those prints looked smaller, maybe like a preteen-sized shoe print. Molds of both sets of shoe prints were taken into evidence, and the smaller child-sized prints were of a pair of Nikes, which those would have been the same shoes that Jacob would have been wearing. Now, this gravel road that scent dogs led police to was actually a pretty long driveway. This driveway was about a quarter of a mile long, and at the end of this driveway, there was a house where the Rassier family lived. The Rassier family was composed of Dan Rassier, who was a 30-something-year-old man who lived at home with his parents still on the family farm. Dan Rassier worked as a music teacher at a local school in the area, and Dan's parents, who he lived with, had been out of the country vacationing in Europe at the time that Jacob was abducted, but Dan had stayed home, so he was home alone. Which isn't weird because, mind you, he's a 30-something-year-old man. Nevertheless, he was home alone. So let's pause here for a second because according to Dan Rassier, on October 22nd, 1989, which is the same night that Jacob was taken, Dan was awoken at about 10:45 p.m. by his dogs going crazy barking. And by 10:45 p.m., the police were already out searching for Jacob. The police had already been alerted to Jacob's abduction, and they were already out searching on foot for him. So Dan says that at 10:45 p.m., his dogs woke him up by barking and making noise, and Dan looked out the window to the end of his driveway. Now, when he does, he sees a couple of flashlights that are moving around near a spot where the family kept their woodpile. Which, at this point, Dan doesn't know that Jacob is missing, and he doesn't know that police are out searching the nearby area, and he damn sure doesn't know that Jacob was taken by someone who just happened to park at the end of his family's driveway. So, without knowing all of this, Dan just assumes that whoever it is with these flashlights near the woodpile, that they're probably just trying to steal firewood, or at the very least, they're looking for something in the yard worth stealing. So Dan sees that there's more than one flashlight out near the woodpile, so he assumes that there's probably more than one person out there prowling around for something to steal. So instead of going out and confronting these multiple thieves, Dan just calls 911 to report the possible theft. When he calls, this is when dispatch made Dan aware that there had been a kidnapping at the end of his driveway, and that the flashlights that he's seeing are just the sheriff's office out searching for the missing boy. So once Dan gets off the phone with dispatch, he walks outside to the officers that are searching for Jacob, and he talks to them for a few minutes. Dan tells the officers that he'll go look around the outside of his house to see if he sees anything out of place or anything that may help in their search for Jacob. And this is the start of the sheriff's office completely dropping the ball and then getting tunnel vision on one man for who knows what reason. Because Dan Rassier would basically be the main suspect in Jacob's disappearance throughout this entire 27-year-long investigation. Okay, so back to where we were. Jacob was abducted that night on a Sunday, and it was the same night that Dan walked outside to talk to the officers after he called 911 to report that he thought somebody was trying to steal something. And it was that next morning on Monday that Dan is pulled from class where he was teaching for officers to search his car. So Dan must have worked at a different school than the one that Jacob went to, because remember, Jacob and his siblings and his best friend were all going to be out of school that Monday, which is why Aaron had been allowed to spend the night at Jacob's in the first place. So possibly a teacher work day or something like that is the reason that Jacob was out of school. But Dan was teaching a class when officers pulled him from that class that he was teaching to search his car. So that leads me to believe that Dan probably taught at a different school. But regardless, Dan was pulled from class and his car was searched. Now, it was at this time that Dan figured he should probably tell police about the car that had pulled into his driveway to turn around on the same night that Jacob was abducted. So the night before, when he'd talked to police, thought someone was stealing, etc., etc. So somebody pulled in his driveway to turn around on the same night that Jacob was abducted. And he was even able to give a super vague description of what the car looked like, but he wasn't able to give a description as far as what the driver looked like. And that makes sense, especially when you consider the fact that Dan's driveway is a quarter of a mile long. I can't see 20 feet in front of me. I would never be able to help police with something like this. But with Dan waiting until the next day to tell officers about the car that he'd seen the night before, this made Dan look suspicious in the eyes of police. Kind of like, why wouldn't Dan think to tell police about this the night before when he was out talking to them when they were searching around his farm? But honestly, I can kind of see how that small of a detail wouldn't seem important until after the fact when Jacob wasn't found immediately. Because I'm assuming that likely everybody thought that Jacob would be found soon after this 911 call was placed. Because remember, everyone thinks that these things can't happen in such a small town in the heart of America in a place like this, but they do. So Dan probably didn't think much about the car that he'd seen until after the fact when he realized that they still hadn't found Jacob. Okay, So Dan's car was searched and his family farm was searched. And Dan was even given multiple lie detector tests, which I've said it once and I'll say it 1,000 times. Y'all, don't ever agree to take a lie detector test, even if you're innocent. It's not going to help you in any way. So just don't do it, okay? Okay. But, oddly enough, after Dan had taken these polygraph tests, he was never given the results of his test. So, that's weird. That just makes me believe that he passed these tests with flying colors, and police weren't ready to give up on their one and only suspect, so they just decided to not tell him whether he passed or failed. And this would go on for almost 30 years with officers suspecting Dan. And for the entire 27 years, Dan agrees and helps police with any and everything that they ask him for. Dan would even agree to be put under hypnosis at one point, which I'd be worried about doing that, I think. Like, can they hypnotize you into saying something that isn't true? I don't know, but that's immediately where my mind goes, so that's a no for me, dog. But Dan does agree to it. So let's talk about it, because I can even see how Dan looked suspicious at first. He's a 30-something-year-old man who still lives at home, which is a farm, so that doesn't seem far-fetched, but still. He's a music teacher who just so happened to be home alone the night that Jacob was kidnapped, and Dan's parents just happened to be gone on some European vacation at that exact same time. And then Dan offers to help police look around his property for Jacob after the 911 call about someone possibly trying to steal his firewood or something else. And then Dan not telling police about the car that had turned around in his driveway until the day after, when he was pulled out of class from teaching and his car was searched. Because at first, police didn't know if there was a car involved or not. They thought so because of the tire tracks. But then they would get information later on that made them think that maybe a car wasn't used at all. Which, once they get that information, that just kind of makes Dan look like an even better suspect. Because if there wasn't a car involved, then that would make sense, because why would Dan need a car to abduct a kid right at the end of his own driveway? Right, he wouldn't. And I guess it looks suspicious that, all of a sudden it's the next day when Dan remembers to tell police about the car turning around. So it kind of seems like any way the police wanted to flip this coin, Dan could look good for this crime, regardless of if a car was used or not. So I can kind of see how police could interpret these things as Dan trying to insert himself into the investigation. Even though that's not at all what Dan was doing, I could see how Dan would be a good, solid suspect at first. I can kind of see how police got here. But then to basically laser focus on Dan for so many years with absolutely zero evidence to back up your beliefs, that's the part that I have a problem with. At some point, we need to look into other possible suspects, which the sheriff's office never did. Another thing that's weird is that the sheriff's office, in this case, are the ones investigating Jacob's disappearance. That's not typically who handles things like this. But let's keep going, because there's still so much left to get to. It was just a day or two after Jacob was abducted that the FBI brought profilers in to create a profile of the abductor that had taken Jacob. The profiler said that Jacob's abductor was likely a white male between 25 to 35 years old. The profiler also believed that Jacob's abductor had recently tried and failed at kidnapping another kid not too far from the area where Jacob was taken. Which, I feel like this is exactly how this would go on an episode of Criminal Minds, so it's gotta be right. And then, on day 3 or 4 of this investigation, Jacob's case aired on the TV show A Current Affair with Maury Povich. I did find this episode on YouTube with a quick search, and during this episode, it was said that before Jacob's abduction, that the police chief in St. Joseph, Minnesota, did not even carry a gun. So this really was one of those small towns where everyone knew everyone and everyone left their doors unlocked at night. And Jacob's case would be the one to change all of that for this really small town. But as soon as I heard that the police chief didn't even carry a gun, I just knew that this police department, sheriff's office, or any other law enforcement in this tiny town was not prepared for the investigation into a missing child. These would probably not be the officers that any of us would choose to be the ones looking for our missing kid if our child was missing. Jacob's parents weren't given a choice, but I could see how this got botched. All that to say, they just didn't have the experience needed to find a missing kid. Now, on the episode of A Current Affair that aired Jacob's case, they closed out his short segment of the show by giving their viewers the FBI profile and the tip line to call with any tips or new information that may help solve the case. They also let their viewers know that there was a $25,000 reward for any information leading to Jacob's safe return. So, in the next few weeks and even months after Jacob's abduction, his parents, Jerry and Patty, would do media interviews and press conferences to try to spread the word about Jacob's case and to try to get Jacob's face out there for everyone in the community to commit to memory. The sheriff's office would also use the media in the same kind of way. The sheriff's office would use their press conferences to ask for the public's help with any leads, tips, or information. And these press conferences by the sheriff's office always seem to bring in a slurry of tips or sightings, and I'm using air quotes on the words tips and sightings. And you'll see why in a minute. And it got to the point where the sheriff's office set up a tip line, but they didn't set this tip line up in a traditional way that you're probably thinking that they did. No, they set this tip line up at the Wetterling's house on their landline phone, so that when people would call the number to leave a tip, the tip line would automatically record the call so that the Wetterlings could play the calls back to the sheriff's office if a tip was called in. So it wasn't a traditional form of a tip line, but hey, I guess it worked. Actually, it probably worked too well. People would call the tip line for Jacob's case at all hours of the night, and of course, since it's connected to the landline of the Wetterlings, they're going to answer the phone no matter what time of the night the calls are coming in at. And all of these tips, and again, I'm using air quotes, would be people claiming that they saw Jacob here, and then someone else would call and say that they saw Jacob there, and then there were people who would call and say that they'd seen Jacob with a man, and then others would call just to report a suspicious-looking man or a suspicious-looking vehicle. And a big part of me wonders if maybe the episode of A Current Affair telling the entire nation that there was a $25,000 reward to be gained by any information leading to Jacob's safe return may have been the root of all these calls of people claiming to have seen Jacob or claiming to know where he was. Once money gets involved in a case like this, the tips are basically tainted. It gives bored people an incentive to do and say things that maybe they know aren't true. It also gives shitty people the incentive to call because they're asses. And then a gross number of these calls on this tip line would be from psychics, claiming to know exactly what had happened to Jacob, or claiming to know exactly where he was, and so on and so forth. And a psychic named Vernon Seats will come up in this case again. It's always him swearing he knows something, or felt something, or yada yada yada. And at one point, this Vernon Seats had even brought Jacob's mom, Patty, a painting of Jacob. He was doing the absolute most during this almost 30-year investigation. But this just brings me back to the reminder that I gave during the Cleveland 3 case. Even if you believe that you're the best psychic in the world, you still weren't there at the place and time of these crimes, so you can't know these things that you're claiming to know for 100% certain. And if you think that you can say what happened with 100% certainty, then I have some harder questions that I'm going to need you to answer. So if you weren't there at the time and place of the crime, or if you weren't somehow involved in the crime to be able to know for 100% sure what happened to somebody's child, then it's probably best for everybody involved if you just don't speak on it. Ooh, I will die on this hill. So it was 6 weeks after Jacob was taken that law enforcement released a new piece of information about a different boy who had been taken at gunpoint by a man wearing a mask just months before Jacob was taken. This boy's name was Jared, and he had been taken by a man in almost the exact same way as Jacob. He was held at gunpoint, forced into the car with a masked man, and sexually assaulted before the man told Jared to run and to not look back, or he would shoot him. Which is eerily similar to what happened to Trevor and Aaron when Jacob was taken. Now, DNA was taken from Jared after he was released from his kidnapper and after he found his way back home and reported the incident to police. But the masked man kept Jared's pants and underwear before letting Jared go, likely as a trophy of sorts, I'm guessing. Jared was taken in January of 1989, and Jacob was taken in October of 1989. Jared was taken from Cold Springs, which is a super close-by town that's only about 15 minutes away from where Jacob was abducted from. Jared was also able to remember that his kidnapper had a handheld police scanner type of radio in his car. So this doesn't seem like this is the first time that this abductor has done this, but we'll come back to this later. So let's keep going, because essentially, from here, this case just goes so cold so fast. Police were following up with all the leads and tips that were coming in, but they were never able to piece everything together in any way where actual evidence would be able to link something to an arrest. Even though, as we'll talk about later, the sheriff's office truly botched this investigation. And I know I keep saying the police did this and the police did that, and I know that the police and the sheriff are two different things. This is just habit for me, and apparently I can't stop. So police were still following up with leads, and the media never let Jacob's story go. They would revisit the case every year on the anniversary of Jacob's abduction, and they would re-release all of the information that they had that was available for the public. And on those same news stations and radio stations that were airing Jacob's case on the anniversary of his disappearance, they would pop in with little bits of information from press conferences or things like that every year, but that was basically it. Like I said, this case really just seemed to go cold. So from here, we're going to fast forward from October 1989 when Jacob was taken and go all the way into 2003 when police finally got some small semblance of viable information. So this is 14 years later. A man came forward and told police that he had been in the area on the night that Jacob was taken, that he had been listening to his police scanner when he heard the possible abduction call come in. This man says that he drove to the location where Jacob had been taken from. Once this man arrived at the scene of the abduction, he says that he saw the bicycles that Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron had been riding still in the ditch, and he says that he'd even spoken to an officer at the scene before he eventually just left the scene. Now, this is exactly what police were waiting on. This could rule out the tire marks that had been found at the end of Dan Rassier's driveway, which also made police wonder if maybe they should go back to their original theory that there was no car used in Jacob's abduction, which would drastically narrow down how far the perpetrator could have gotten with Jacob on foot. So this is the piece of information that I was talking about earlier, where police were kind of able to turn whatever information they had in a way to make Dan, the 30-something-year-old music teacher who lived with his parents, look guilty. Now, this man says that he did remember being at the scene on the night that Jacob was abducted, but that he doesn't remember what kind of tires he had on his car then. Which, that would have been 14 years later, so of course he didn't know what brand of tires he had on his car. I drive my car every single day, and I have no idea what brand tires are on it. Because when police took plaster molds of the tire tracks that they'd found at the scene, they were able to match the tire tread against different tire brands and manufacturers, and they were able to match the tire tracks that they'd found at the scene to a brand of tires that the old department store Sears would have sold and manufactured. So police had known from the beginning what brand of tires that they needed to find to be able to match the tracks that they'd found. And then this guy that came forward saying that he had been listening to the police scanner before he rode to the scene of the abduction, he didn't just wake up one day 14 years after the abduction and decide that he should probably go tell police that he was at the scene. This guy had actually been at a party or a dinner or something like that, and he was talking to someone in law enforcement when somehow the Jacob Wetterling case came up in conversation. And when Jacob's name did come up, this guy tells the officer that he's talking to about how he had heard the call come in on his scanner and how he had driven to the scene of the crime, how he'd seen the boy's bike still laying in the ditch, and he even told the guy that he was talking to that he had talked to an officer of some kind that night. But then after that he'd gotten in his car and he'd left. So of course this officer that dude is talking to tells him that he has to go report this to the department so that they at least have it on record. And of course, this guy is completely innocent, and he just really didn't think much about what had happened that night 14 years ago, especially when the police never reached back out to talk to him or question him after the fact. Like, the police didn't reach out to this guy 3 weeks later and ask him why he was there or what he was doing or anything like that. No one ever reached out, so he just assumed that the officers didn't need anything from him. And this is the exact definition of see something, say something, because this tiny piece of information that this guy had that seems like nothing completely changed the way the police looked at how this crime could have been committed. Because for 14 years, the police had been so sure that Dan Rassier was responsible, but they hadn't been able to prove it. And now they were pretty sure that no car was used in this kidnapping, which only led officers working the case to believe that whoever had taken Jacob had to be on foot, probably a local, and definitely someone who lived close by. Which again, all signs point back to Dan Rassier looking good for this kidnapping. And all of this because one guy came forward 14 years later to say that he had been being nosy, and he was actually at the crime scene shortly after police arrived. But now, at least this would explain the car that Dan claimed to have seen turning around at the end of his driveway on the night that Jacob was taken. So no matter how small it seems, if you're even very loosely connected to something like this, just go give a statement so that they have every possible piece of information available to be able to accurately work their case. Another thing is that police scanners will keep coming up in this case, because we'll later learn that Jacob's abductor and murderer would also use police scanners as a way to evade law enforcement. Now, throughout this entire process, police are still somehow able to get search warrants after search warrant after search warrant to keep searching the Dan Rassier's family farm over and over again. And police would continuously pull Dan out of classes that he was teaching to question him about his involvement. Which, that can't look good when your kid's music teacher is being pulled out of multiple classes throughout the school year to be questioned about a missing child and possible murder. And, spoiler alert, Dan Rassier was in no way, shape, or form connected to anything that happened to Jacob whatsoever. So they really ruined his reputation, possibly his love life, probably his career, for almost 30 years for absolutely no reason. But let's keep going. Now, it wasn't until 2004 that Jared would go back to the officers again to talk to them about his own abduction back in January of 1989, just months before Jacob was kidnapped. Police had this information back in 1989 when Jacob was abducted, but it seems like they just never looked into it to see if the two abductions could be connected by the same perpetrator. Jared always felt like his abduction was connected to Jacob's, though. Now, I say that police had this information back in 1989 when Jacob was kidnapped, but from my understanding, the police in Cold Springs, where Jared was kidnapped from, they had this information. And even though Cold Springs is only about 30 minutes from St. Joseph, where Jacob was kidnapped, it doesn't seem like the police in the surrounding areas were interacting with one another or sharing information with one another that could be helpful. So Jared goes to the police in St. Joseph, where Jacob was kidnapped from in 2004, to tell them his account of what happened on the day that he was kidnapped. He tells them about the police scanner in the man's car. He tells them that the man sexually assaulted him, and then he told him to run and not look back or he would be shot. Jared also told them that the entire time that this man had held him against his will, that the man had asked Jared multiple times if he would recognize him or if he would be able to point him out later. And Jared told the abductor no over and over and over again that he wouldn't be able to recognize him. So it sounds like Jared was asked over and over again if he could see this man's face or if he was looking at this man's face. Like his abductor was worried that Jared may be able to identify him pretty easily. But Jared was smart though, and every time he was asked, he would say no. Which is, in my opinion, probably the only reason that Jared was let go and not killed. Jared and his family were so affected by Jared's abduction that eventually they just moved out of the area altogether. And Jared came forward with this information in 2004 in hopes that it would bring in anybody else that maybe this had happened to in the surrounding areas. Now, another reason that I think that Jared and his family ended up moving out of this area altogether is because these same exact kinds of attacks were happening all over Painesville, which is only about 20 minutes from Cold Springs where Jared and his family lived. So if you were to draw 3 dots and draw a straight line, that's what you'd be looking at. You'd be looking at Painesville, Cold Springs, and then St. Joseph where Jacob was taken. And they're all relatively close by. They're all within like a 20-30 minute drive, so it's just a few small towns all clustered together right there. Now, these attacks were happening so frequently that it was making the news, and in total there were at least 8 different attacks that we know of in the Painesville area in the mid to late 80s. And all of the attacks were the same. It was a man in a mask of some sort, and he would confront a preteen or teenage boy. He would either come up behind them or confront them with a gun or a knife. He would then sexually assault them and then let them go, telling them to run but to not look back, or he would shoot. Does this sound familiar? Because it should. Because that's exactly what happened to Jacob, Trevor, and Aaron, and it's exactly what happened to Jared 9 months before Jacob was taken. And Jared coming forward got all 8 of the Painesville victims to come forward and share their stories, and they were just all eerily similar. But this still didn't lead to any new suspects or any new arrest. Now, after Jared came forward in 2004 to share his story, it wasn't until 2009 that police got another piece of information. And this is when they thought they'd finally cracked the case. Because in 2009, a psychiatrist from Milwaukee, Wisconsin came forward about a previous patient of hers. A patient named Vernon Seats. Remember that name? That's the psychic that kept offering to help Patty and Jerry by giving them all of his psychic knowledge about what he thought happened to Jacob. I told you he'd come back up. So Vernon Seats died from natural causes in 2009, and his psychiatrist came forward to tell police that Vernon had admitted to her that he'd killed 2 boys back in 1958. Now, from the article that I read, if this is true, if Vernon Seats did kill 2 boys in 1958, then he would have been 12 years old at the time that he says he killed these 2 boys. Now, Vernon's psychiatrist claims that she only came forward and told police about this because during the course of her seeing Vernon, he had claimed that he was going to go to police and tell on himself. So I don't know if this was her breaking some kind of confidentiality clause or what. I'm not sure how that works when we're talking about someone who's possibly killed 1 or more people. But regardless, she did take the information she had to the police. And this was enough information for police to be able to obtain a search warrant for Vernon Seats' home address. But by the time the officers made it to Vernon's house, he had already passed away from natural causes. Inside of Vernon's house, his body was still there. And right next to the bed that his body was still in, police found child pornography, books on cannibalism, paintings of young boys being tortured, and multiple newspaper clippings about missing persons cases, especially children, and a lot of those were of Jacob's case. They also found a lot of missing children's, missing persons flyers. They had been laminated, though, for safekeeping. One of those laminated missing persons flyers was Jacob's. Children's shoes were also found inside of Vernon's house. This creep did not have kids, grandkids, so why were there just a bunch of kids' shoes laying around? Another super creepy thing that was found inside of this house was a collection of different arrays of hair. Black hair, blonde hair, brown hair. Just these, clumps of human hair. Now, this maybe could kind of be explained away because Vernon was the owner and operator of a barber shop. So this could be kids' hair that he'd cut at his barber shop. Like maybe a kid would come in, get a haircut, and then later when they leave, Vernon bags it and takes it home for whatever sick, twisted reason that I don't want to think about. Or he possibly could have gotten these clumps of hair in a way more violent, malicious way. I don't know. There was also a piece of bone found in his house. There were just so many things found in this house. Things from bondage hanging from the walls and ceilings, which wouldn't be weird except for all the child porn and random pictures of kids that he had laying around. Now, mind you, This is the same man that had the audacity to show up at the Wetterlings' house shortly after their son was quite literally snatched from them, claiming to be a psychic who just wanted to help. The Wetterlings had given Vernon pieces of Jacob's clothes and personal belongings in hopes that it would better help him reach the spirit realm, if you will. They were just trying to do anything that would help them find their son, and sadly, he was taking advantage of every bit of that. But even out of all the things that were found inside of Vernon's house to suggest that he probably needed more than any psychiatrist could help with, all of these things were DNA tested, and none of the hair, shoes, or pieces of bone that were found were able to be linked back to Jacob in any way. So, I think this is a good stopping point for part 1, because we still have so much to get into. So many more things to talk about, and we'll do that next week. Patreon members, the December episode will be out on Friday, so 2 days from now. I'm pretty excited. I have slacked so much on Patreon that I feel like I'm just going to have to start pumping episodes out like as quick as I can just to get everybody caught up to where they should be for what they paid for. So be on the lookout for that. Let's do a review of the week and then go feed our crotch goblins. But before I do that, if y'all don't start leaving some sort of written review soon, I'm gonna run out of ones to read. You can leave a written review on Apple Podcast and Audible, and I do check both places. So let's get some new reviews in. And I know, some of you are like me and you don't have an iPhone. Android for life. Steal somebody's phone. I mean, don't steal it, borrow it, and then give it back, but like, steal your coworker's phone, or your husband's phone, or your kid's phone, or your neighbor's phone. Go on there and leave a review, and just let me know that it's you, that you stole their phone, and what name you want me to use. Somewhere in the review, just leave it there somewhere. I'll read it, I swear. Alright, I'm done. Let's do a review of the week, and let's get out of here. This review comes from Tamarzuk. Tamarzuk. I don't know. Anyways, it's 5 stars. It says, covers great stories. While not as quote-unquote formal or quote-unquote official sounding as some bigger name podcast, Mama Murdered a Podcast gives the feeling of a good friend sharing an amazing story that they heard. She's also very thorough in the research and the notes for each episode, which is helpful when a story really inspires you to dive deeper. I highly recommend you try the show, especially if you're on the lookout for unique cases and a less quote-unquote sensationalized approach. Thank you so much, T. Marzak. I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. You're my favorite human alive. Let's do it again. Same time, same place, next Wednesday. See you then.
That's how my mama murdered a podcast.